So are you ready to get started?
Sure.
Okay, great. Well, Sersie, thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to have you with me today.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I know we've only known each other, I think maybe a month, and we've, conversed virtually. But
Yes.
you're like one of those people, and it's very
Mhm.
rare where I meet them, and I feel
Yeah.
like I've known them for a long time.
Yeah. I feel the same. Yes. Yes.
Just just a connection there somehow.
Yes.
Um, so I thought we could start off by just sharing your story.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about, your history, and then, how the faithful vegan came about.
Okay, I'll start. Well, it started back several years ago. I was on my second pregnancy, and I had a normal pregnancy as I would figure it to be. And during my last trimester, the doctor diagnosed me with high blood pressure. And so they ended up putting me on medication. And I guess I wasn't too alarmed by that. I wasn't really sure. I've never had high blood pressure before. But in retrospect, what I know about high blood pressure now is that it usually, if you have high blood pressure during your pregnancy, it increases your chances of having complications before, during, or after. And that African American women actually have a higher risk of having high blood pressure during pregnancy. So at the time, I didn't know all of this, but I was diagnosed with it. And so when my son was born, I had a complication during birth. And so he lost oxygen to the brain. And so what happened was is that he had to be basically taken care of basically 24 hours a day because he was unable to basically swallow on his own. So we had to constantly suction him, and so it was something that was requiring 24-hour care. So at this point, you're kind of dealing with this trauma of this crazy episode that happens in the delivery room, where I almost lost my life as well, but then, the trauma that happened to him. And so he passed away at a little bit after his first birthday. And so you could imagine that I'm dealing with the trauma of, at first, you having that whole traumatic pregnancy, but not only that, not really having time to grieve that because you have to go right into this mode of taking care of a child 24 hours a day. And so you go right into that mode. And so when he finally, or when he does actually pass away because of the severity of his injuries, everything comes rushing in. So at this point, I would say I would call it probably the rock bottom of life, as you can imagine, emotionally, physically, spiritually, um, depression, just a lack of zeal for life, or but at the same time, on the flip side, there is this part of you that is connecting with your family, connecting with your church and your spirituality, and you're battling to try to get out of this mode that you're in as your whole family's trying to help you grieve. And so at that point in my life, I probably was the heaviest I've ever been. And a lot of that probably had to do with the fact that I wasn't active, the trauma, the stress, the lack of movement, because you're pretty much sitting there most of the day taking care of a very sick child. And so that's the picture that I was kind of at when I kind of intersected this health journey, as you would call it. And so a friend of mine, maybe a year later after that, came to me and said, hey, I'm doing a Daniel fast. Why don't you do the Daniel fast with me? And for those of you who don't know what a Daniel fast is, it's basically, it comes out of the Bible. And this is where Daniel basically opposed the king who wanted everyone to eat the king's diet, which was very high in meat. And Daniel opposed that and said, I'm going to eat the food that God has told me to eat, basically nuts, seeds, fruits, and so forth. And so he took a stand and said, I'm going to eat what I eat, and you guys eat what you eat. And if I am weaker than what your men are, then you can go ahead and I'll serve that king. And so what happened in the end is that after this whole so many days, not only was Daniel stronger than the men, but they actually said he was 10 times stronger. And so what the Daniel fast pretty much is a whole food plant-based diet where you eliminate processed food, sugars, anything that's chemically based, and you basically just eat whole real foods. And so this is what she said to me. She said, you know, why don't you join into this Daniel fast? And at first I was like, well, I'll do it, but I'll adjust it. I'll add some eggs, because I wasn't sure if I could really commit myself to something of that magnitude at the time. And so I was trying to tweak it. And I remember so clearly, she arrested me at the moment and she said, if you're going to do this fast, you need to just do it the way it is. And so incorporated with all of that, of course, you're having your prayer time, your alone time of trying to connect with God, along with this whole food plant-based diet. And so something about that connected with me when she said that. And so I said, okay, I'm going to go all in with this. And so I went into this 30-day fast. And I, you know, you read your scriptures, you're kind of abstaining from certain things, and you're doing this diet. And within 30 days, it was almost like I couldn't even necessarily know if it was 30 or 25, but it was almost like this miracle happened. My blood pressure was regulated. I lost a lot of weight. My energy was back. I had mental clarity, spiritual clarity. I could hear the voice of God clearer. My depression was gone. And all of this happened within 30 or so days of doing this fast. And it blew my mind, because at that point, I couldn't understand how I've done fast before and I'd never had that, but there was something about putting the spiritual, connecting it with the diet, that blew this thing off the roof. And so I couldn't believe it. And I was saying to myself, how could it be that all of this changed in 30 days? And I've never embarked on this before. I've never understood that food can actually change the composition of your body, which filters into your emotional and filters into your spiritual. Where have I been? Where has this been? And so that's how the Faithful Vegan was born. I felt like I was given this mission to now, the journey that I've been through experiencing this, to share it with other people and let them understand just how connected our spiritual lives are, our emotional lives are, and what we eat. And that's where the Faithful Vegan was birthed.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, let me ask you, how hard was it, like the first week that you went on to the Daniel fast? Were you having difficulty eating whole plant foods? Were they not tasty to you? Or kind of walk me through kind of what you experienced and how you got through it.
In the beginning, it was a little difficult, because again, it wasn't your salty, fatty foods that I was used to. But I think what helped me kind of see it through was that I had this idea that I was boxed into the fast. And so that's what kept me going. And so in the beginning, it was kind of different, but I had a lot of recipes, and then I had the support of doing it in a group. And so somebody would say, have you tried this? Why don't you try that food and that? And so I would say after maybe 7 days of kind of getting into it, you almost develop this little bit of a desire to kind of figure this thing out. And so for me, that's how it kind of went. So my palate in the beginning was a little challenging, but as I just kept going, it's like my palate kind of adjusted, and then it became almost a stimulating thing where it was like, oh, this actually tastes pretty good. And then I just kept going.
Yeah, so you probably had both the support and a sense of accountability, because you said, hey, I'm going to do this, so you want to see it through.
I wanted to see it through. And I knew it was just 30 days.
Yeah.
There was something about having a timeline to it. When I started it, I thought, well, I'm just going to do this 30 days and then I'm done with it. But I wasn't expecting all of those benefits. And so after doing 30 days, I just never turned back, because everything that I gained from it, I just couldn't walk away from.
Yeah. So what year was that when you did the Daniel fast?
I did the Daniel fast at the end of 2012.
So you describe veganism as a God-given tool to manage health and embrace compassionate living. Tell me more about the tell me more about both the embracing God part as well as
Mhm.
the compassionate living.
Well, what I realized, and like I said, it stemmed from that fast, but as I got deeper into researching and just kind of living this thing out, I really saw that that the veganism was, it was more than just a food. It was more than just a plate, because what it was doing was that it was, again, healing myself, healing people, but at the same time, my knowledge expands and I realized that, wait a minute, it's not just us, but it's the way we treat animals, it's the way we treat our environment. And I kind of believe that all of those issues, whether you talk about how you treat others, the environment, I believe that is a spiritual principle. I think many of us, when we embark on spiritual journeys, most of that has to do with our core beliefs and what do we value and how do we treat others, how do we treat ourselves. And so I started to connect those dots where I realized how we eat is really an act of how we treat ourselves and how we're stewards of the bodies that we've been given and how we're stewards in the planet that we've been given and the animals that we've been given, and what is our responsibility. And so I felt like all of these things were kind of coming back to a central spot of our core beliefs. And so that's how I figure it ties in to spirituality. So I believe that when you eat well, it's a spiritual practice because you're basically complimenting God. You're saying, God, I acknowledge that you've given me this body and this environment and these people, and I'm going to do my best to do it in a manner that is faithful to you.
I love that. I love that. You know, I've interviewed a lot of people for my
Mm-hmm.
blog to profile their stories. And it's so interesting. The one question that I've
Mm-hmm.
asked them is, what surprised you the most? And they've described it as almost a spiritual awakening, you know, not
Yes.
necessarily seeking it out, but it just
Yes.
happening.
It just happens.
And they'll say things like, you know, I just felt more at ease, or I just felt calmer or at peace with myself. And, you know, I've wondered, you know, kind of, I guess I've hypothesized that
Right.
it probably has to do with what you just said, that you're kind of living your values. Because I think most
Mm.
people have an innate sense of compassion.
Right.
And so when you're eating this way, you're showing compassion to the animals, to the planet, to others. And you know, there's some other theories thrown out there that I
Yeah.
don't know if they're accurate. Maybe they do
Yeah.
play into it, but I think
Yeah.
that specific one resonates most with me.
Yeah. And then not only that too, I think something happens physically because you get mental clarity, spiritual clarity. I think a lot of times we don't realize that what we're actually eating is clouding our judgment half of the time, is clogging our spiritual ears some of the time. And so those are distractions spiritually. And so when you start eating well and feeding your mind and clearing your mind, then you could embark on those spiritual journeys so much more easier and clearer.
Tell me more about when you talk about bringing faith to the kitchen table. You know, maybe talk a little more. Is that more on a practical side, you know, for
It's
families
both.
or
It's
okay.
both because I feel like the church is a place for healing. And I think we've done a great job with talking about the spiritual side of things and the spiritual healing. I think a lot of times when people come to the church, they're looking for that. But I think we've done a not so great job in terms of connecting all of the aspects of our being. And I think you you can't just focus on the spiritual side and ignore emotional, spiritual, physical, because they all bleed into each other. And I think if we're truly going to um, you know, reach the whole person, I think we have to address those physical places. And so when I say bring faith to the kitchen table, it's challenging the person to say, where does your faith fit into how you eat? You know, I also talk about the concept of blessing our food. You know, we've accustomed to bless our food. You know, God bless the food, we're the hands that made it. But are we really blessing a plate that's worthy to be blessed, right? Do we know where our food is coming from and how it was processed and the hands that made it and under what duress? Is the food that we're eating actually nourishing to our bodies? And so these are questions that I challenge people who are of faith to say, let's bring faith to the kitchen table and look at our plates, look at where our plates extend from that and how it impacts the world, and figure, you know, they actually intersect. And I think it's a worthy discussion to have.
Yeah, I love what you said, because, you know, a lot of times, so I have some friends and relatives that are very disciplined about saying grace before they eat. But it's so, when I'm around them, and admittedly, I'm not as disciplined, but when I'm by myself, but when I am with them, they'll say it so quick. It's kind of like to check a box, and then what's on the plate, you know, I never really kind of thought about that connection between what food they're blessing and is it worthy of being blessed or not. Just because it's calories on a plate, you know, it could be completely destroying your body and creating, you know, creating other stresses in the universe, if you will.
Exactly. And so I think by bringing faith to our kitchen table, it challenges us to not live in isolation, but to allow our faith to not only just be compartmentalized to our spiritual life, but to bleed over to what are you doing physically? I think a lot of times you'll have a lot of people in the church that are suffering from high blood pressure or diabetes. And the point of the reference would be, well, let's pray about it. But I think even going beyond prayer about it, how about let's prevent it, right? You know, and there's nothing wrong with prayer. I believe we should pray about every aspect of our lives, don't get me wrong. But I think there's an aspect of this that we can prevent it. We can manage it. We could reverse it. We could, you know, play a role by, I think, doing what Daniel did in the Bible, which is stand up against the foods that you know you're not supposed to be eating. And he's a perfect example of someone in the Bible that integrated his faith and what he eat, how he stood for God.
Yeah. So it's the prayer plus the action.
Prayer plus the action.
Yeah. You know, the food that gets served there, you know, whether it's following a funeral or if there's some special event, you know, and what gets served there is, you know, my arteries just, you know, kind of clog up looking at it. So what?
And so it's a contradiction. I live in the South, so this is something that's prevalent in all churches. I'll tell you the honest truth. It's just Southern. It's a certain Southern cooking, and so, for example, I think it's a contradiction that we're not really aware that we're doing, because we would have this wonderful spiritual message that will feed our minds and our souls, and then we'll have a buffet of some foods that just that's harmful to our bodies, right? And so I think the issue is that we haven't connected the food to the faith. We've connected cigarettes, we've connected drugs, we've connected all of these quote unquote evils, but I think that we haven't connected what we're actually eating and how it's affecting our bodies just as negatively as those other sources. So I think a lot of it is preaching that message, and this is why I believe that, and this is where I feel that the Faithful Vegans mission is to go into these churches and say, hey, this is an issue that needs to be preached from the pulpit. And then when we go downstairs, we should be eating things that edify our bodies and edify our minds, not just downstairs, but in our lives, period. And by doing that, it's an example of godly living, just like how you'd be doing anything else.
Yeah. So tell me about what you're doing with the Faithful Vegan. I know you're coaching, you've got a fabulous podcast. You want to kind of talk through more of what you do?
Yeah, I have a podcast that's I'm very passionate about, and it's entitled "Eat Your Best Life" because I'm trying to show everyone that there's a best life that you could actually eat. And so in this podcast, really, it's just talking about how a whole food plant-based diet and faith can enhance your life. And so a lot of it is about reversing and preventing chronic disease, which I feel like the church is a place of healing. And I think this is a message that kind of piggybanks the message of healing as well, that we could pray and we could worship. But I believe that part of that healing is ingesting and doing other lifestyle methods that actually keep us healthy so that we are able to do the mission that God has called us to do. And so that's one aspect of the Physical Vegan. Like I said, I do the one-on-one coaching, and I do, which this is probably one of my favorite parts, is I do kitchen overhauls with different families. And so I go into the homes and we go through their cabinets and we rearrange it, we do grocery shopping, and then I help them make meals and just get people like a kickstart. Because I think a lot of times if you can make your home a safe place to eat, and then it's just so much easier to.
Yeah, yeah. I think changing the environment is so critical because if it's
Yeah,
not there, you have
so
to
easy to slip.
it
Yeah,
is, yeah, and you really have to go out of your way if you really, really want it. You have to like get in the car and go.
exactly,
But if it's not
exactly,
there, so
exactly.
someone watching this who
Mhm.
believes in the message, believes in what you're saying, and would like
Yeah.
to maybe get involved with their church in terms of, because
Mm.
it seems like the church is like a natural place for community to kind of
Right.
support one another, kind of what you
Mhm.
experienced. What should they do? Like, how should they go about approaching the church to maybe consider this?
I think one of the things you could do is, and I always say, go to the leadership, because I think if it comes from the leadership, it's definitely received by everyone better. But educate your leadership, let them see, because like I said, I think a lot of times it's just lack of knowledge or even just not even really thinking about it. Give them education, have a cooking class. We did many cooking classes at my church. We've done, there's other programs out there that you can host it in your church, like a diabetes reversal seminar, which we've done at our church. There's things that you can do to kind of connect, have a walking group, start to do things that make people start associating your church with healthy living. And sometimes you could start off with small things like, hey, we're doing a Daniel fast. Many churches do the Daniel fast in January of the month. You don't have to wait till January. You can actually do a Bible study with the Daniel fast and start it in June or July, and let people see what it feels like to actually feel healthy, because that will be the best sales that there could possibly be, is that when you get to experience how it feels to eat well, it's a winner.
Yeah, yeah. And I love the 30-day timeline too, because people
Hmm.
can say, well, I can always go back to what I was doing. It's only
Right,
30 days. So it gives them
right,
a little bit of an out or safety,
right.
to kind of switch gears if they want to.
And you're doing it as a group and you've kind of committed it spiritually. So I think that also gives you another hook, that you're not just doing a diet. You kind of said, okay, in front of all of your peers, we're going to spiritually do this together. And that gives you a little extra strength.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. All right. Well, Sersie, thank you so much for your time. I've enjoyed this. I've enjoyed talking. I always learn something when I talk to you,
Yes,
even if it's just for, 5, 10, 20 minutes.
yes, yes, yes.
So anything you want to add before we sign off here?
No, just thank you for having me. And if anyone's interested in knowing more, you can find me on The Faithful Vegan on Facebook or on Instagram. I'm at thefaithful.com.
Awesome. And I'll include links to those in the description below.
All right, perfect. Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Thanks, Sersie.
All right, bye.